Iranian companies got pretty good at finding multiple supply chains with multiple layers of redundancy so that if one route broke down, they could shift to another one. And the other thing that they did is that unlike companies in Europe or the US, for example, that really have grown accustomed to the idea of like just-in-time manufacturing, Iranian firms began to maintain larger inventories of the parts and materials that they need. In some sectors, it's typical to have 3 months of inventory just sitting in your warehouse.
So basically, the Trump administration has imposed a blockade, a naval blockade on Iran in response to its closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran now says that it's reopening the Strait of Hormuz since there's a ceasefire imposed in Lebanon, and apparently they're satisfied with the conditions of the ceasefire. And it has proven to the Iranians, as the way in a way that they would put it, that the Trump administration is able to put pressure on Israel and willing to put pressure on Israel. But this blockade, it doesn't seem like it's going to be removed. There's a lot of ambiguous language about whether or not the Iranians are actually opening up the strait to where it was before, or they're basically just saying, hey, you can travel on our routes with our permission now. It's open according to Iran, as opposed to it's open, period. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's part of my Substack newsletter. It's called Badlands. It's at borzu.substack.com. I'm joined today by a really smart person who I've talked to for years, Esfandiar Batmalgeldij. He is the founder, editor of Bourse and Bazaar. It's sort of a newsletter, a consulting firm, a platform for business in Iran. He was quoted extensively in a recent New York Times article about how Iran could break the blockade without really, dealing with the U.S. naval assets that are stationed in the Sea of Oman. I guess I want to ask you, Esfandiar, first of all, welcome. Thanks for showing up on my podcast.
Good to be here, Borzu.
I guess I just want to ask you, there's this monochromatic view of the Iranian economy that seems to be like an amalgam of what the Iranian economy was like 20 or 30 years ago and what people in the Washington establishment think that, oil-rich economy means. Could you just break down for us? Oil is important, natural gas, less for cash, but definitely for the economy because Iran doesn't export so much natural gas, if any. But can you just break down for us what is the significance of oil in Iran's economy and what would a prolonged blockade of oil exports mean for Iran's economy?
So, Borzo, you're entirely right that there is a kind of monochromatic or uncomplicated view of Iran's economy, but Iran's economy is actually very complicated. And one of the things that my research has really focused on over the last decade or so is the idea that Iran's economy has actually gotten more complex over time in response to the pressure of sanctions. And sanctions really changed the trajectory of Iran's economy in around 2012. But in the decade leading up to that point, Iran was undergoing the kind of development that a lot of other large middle income countries were going through, which was basically a phase of industrialization and globalization. And although Iran's economy has been really dominated by oil for a long time, oil is the single most important type of export and the largest source of revenue for the government budget. In the period of that first decade of the 2000s, the oil revenues that Iran was earning and also foreign investment in Iran, and there was a significant amount of foreign investment, really contributed to the development of a much more diverse kind of economy where, for example, you had a lot of non-oil industry, for example, mining and manufacturing that developed. And then also, because Iran is a large country with a large population, you had the development of a fairly advanced services sector. So everything from health and education services to also financial services. This is the period in which the Tehran Stock Exchange really becomes a big player in Iran's economy and in the financialization of the economy. So by the start of the period in which sanctions were imposed, Iran's economy was looking a lot like the kinds of economies that we see around the world today and think these are, pretty developed and advanced countries.
Like what?
But
Like, give me examples of what you could compare Iran to. Indonesia,
yeah, I
for
mean,
example,
yeah, I guess, maybe the classic comparison is that Iran is very
Latin
similar to
America.
Brazil is a good one
Hmm.
potentially as like a large country with a fairly diverse economy, but that has some oil. But I think the classic example is to say that Iran is sort of like Turkey, but with an oil industry. And up until the imposition of sanctions in 2012, Iran and Turkey were tracking each other very well in terms of their development. Iran was actually slightly ahead in the living standards that it was delivering to its population. That all changed with the imposition of sanctions because of the severity of those sanctions that sought to